I'm Martin Reeves. I'm chairman of the BCG Henderson Institute, which is a business think tank. And my field is strategy. And I'm interested in anything to do with business or even personal strategy, essentially.
How does personal strategy manifest itself?
Well, I think one can think strategically about anything, everyday problems, personal issues, life plans, as well as the more traditional business associations. I mean, I define strategy as any systematic pattern of thought or action which biases the odds of favorable outcomes. And so you could apply that to, for instance, your career as easily as you could apply it to your business strategy.
How rare do you think strategy is in either personal life or business life?
Well, strategy is a very slippery word. It can mean the tools and the techniques of strategy. It can mean the process of creating strategies. It can be a synonym for something which really isn't very strategic, which is a plan. It can mean all sorts of things. So my definition is essentially anything which gets the job done, the job of problem solving. Now, in that sense, I think great strategies are few and far between. If you look at the returns of companies over a 100-year period, the vast majority of value has been added by a relatively small number of companies. So really great strategies that endure are quite rare. I think at the other end of the spectrum, every company has some sort of process for creating something like a plan or a strategy. Some of them are great, some of them are not great, some of them get implemented, some don't. But it's tremendously valuable, of course, if in this uncertain world you can create something that beats the odds of success.
How do you measure beating the odds, right? I mean, at one level, you're saying it's rare and yet lots of people do it.
Well, lots of people do it in a sort of a ritualistic fashion. You can measure it quite easily, actually. You can measure success over, say, the Treasury bill rate. So, just by putting your money in a bank account, you'll get a certain low level of return. So, did you get a high return? Now, of course, if we measure it just in one period, it could be luck, it could be fluke. But if we systematically over time get above average returns, that's rare and extraordinarily valuable. In fact, it's becoming more and more valuable. Some people question whether strategy is relevant anymore in a very fast-changing world, but the gap in performance between winners and losers in business is actually increasing over time. So it's more relevant than ever.
Do you think that's as a result of those businesses that are outperforming doing strategy better or well, or do you think they get lucky?
Well, I believe in Japanese, geisha have three words for customers. There's one word they use when somebody employs a geisha once, and if they're curious enough to go back twice, then there's another word. And they only use the word customer if the person goes back more than 3 times. The same principle applies in business. Yes, I mean, entrepreneurs can be lucky once. They're very unlikely to be lucky twice. And if you have your business and you're successful, like Warren Buffett, 20, 30, 40 years, over decades, you beat the odds, then it's extremely unlikely to be due to chance alone. But I'm quite agnostic as to what that thing is. In fact, that was the subject of my book, Your Strategy Needs a Strategy. What is the thing that gets the job done in the modern circumstance, given technology, geopolitics, uncertainty, and all of the other forces that we're used to?
If you look out in the marketplace now, what are some companies where you think, you might know them intimately, or maybe you just look at them from afar and go, you guys have done a great job because you have outlined a plan, executed the plan, and are getting, beating the market?
Well, there are many. Beating the market is actually not rare. At any time, of course, there are companies above the average and below the average. So that's, whoever the hot company of the day is. I think doing so to a very big extent is rarer. And doing so persistently over time requires constant revisiting of the strategy. And so nowadays, actually, for a company to even last 100 years, let alone be successful over a long period of time, is extraordinarily rare. So when you look at companies like Berkshire Hathaway, Warren Buffett's company, that really is an extraordinary achievement, because most companies are famous for a day. They are successful for a couple of years. So if you look at the current environment, I mean, tremendous value has been added by the big tech companies. If you look at Apple and Google and those sorts of companies. I mean, they've come from nothing in a relatively short space of time and added something like $6 trillion of value, which is more than the lifetime value added of some famous sort of legacy companies. So that's a huge achievement to have become dominant forces in the digital age. But the thing is, it doesn't guarantee future success because the conditions are constantly changing. So there's no guarantee that Microsoft or Apple or Google will be the champions in 10 years' time under the technology of artificial intelligence, for example.
I was just thinking, use Berkshire Hathaway as an example of a company that's strategically, they've set out a strategy and succeeded over the long term. And I was just wondering how much Warren Buffett in the same chair and Charlie Munger alongside him for so long versus the reduction in tenure of CEOs. Do you have to have consistency of strategy in a company? How much is it linked to the CEO's tenure?
A little bit, but I don't think it's a dominant factor because, of course, you can have consistently mediocre strategy or consistently bad strategy. I think in the case of, I'm a student of Munger. As a strategist, I can't ignore his lessons and learnings. And he had a very peculiar philosophy, which was essentially avoiding hyperactivity, but occasionally having definitive action. So for him, the wisest action of a financier most of the time is to do nothing because there's no possibility of beating the odds in a very competitive market. When he gets enthused by something, he would have essentially a psychological checklist that would check his enthusiasm and calibrate it for objectivity. And if he passed these self-imposed tests of self-control and self-awareness, then in a contrary fashion, he would act very decisively. So they have this unusual patience and ability to act decisively and have had very high returns over many, many years. Now, whether that track record can survive the incredible strategic contribution of Munger, I guess we'll have to see. But it's very much the exception rather than the rule. In fact, you can measure that. You can measure something called the fade rate. So the fade rate is you take companies with bigger than average returns and you look at the rate at which that fades to the mean. And we know that over time, that fade rate has increased. Why has it increased? Probably two dominant factors. One of them is market efficiency. Capital markets arbitrage away advantage very quickly. They don't, financial markets don't ask how well are you doing. They ask how much better are you doing for me today. It's a sort of a ratchet effect. And the second factor is technology. Digital business models are scaled and replicated very, very rapidly. So by default, advantage doesn't last very long.
What do you think about companies being secretive or not secretive about their strategy? The example I'm thinking of is Tesla, when they sort of published right at the beginning, Elon Musk laid out the plan he had for Tesla and executed it. And their competitors just, obviously ignored him at the beginning.
Well, the thing about a great strategy is it's still powerful if your competitor knows about it because it's hard to replicate. And I mean, to grossly simplify, in the history of business strategy, it's a very relatively young discipline. It started around the late 50s, early 60s. You had an era where it was about scale and position. And obviously, if you are the incumbent, if you have a 60% market share, you can still screw it up, but it gives you a tremendous potential cost advantage in a stable environment. So that's an example where you could say our strategy is to be the biggest and the low cost. And that strategy is useless to the smallest guy unless the biggest guy screws up. Now, in a more dynamic environment, scale in activities that change is much less useful. So it's more like a logic of competing on capabilities and systems. And again, if Amazon, for example, published its IT blueprints and its long-term strategy, it would be extremely hard for anyone to replicate that complexity and that depth of capability. So for simple strategies, there may be a trick, a tactic, which, if known to others, it could be emulated. For example, we're going to bring out a purple toothbrush. It would take a while before you figured out what the other guy was doing, although you could observe it and imitate it. With a robust strategy based on long-term capabilities or scale, really, secrecy, I think, is not all it's cracked up to be. It's more the secret is in the capability.
Well, and or maybe the certainly in your new book, The Imagination Machine, you've got what I think of as a activity fit map example towards the end. And I was just thinking, somebody like Southwest Airlines, the way in which they ran their business or the way in which they run their business isn't a secret. And yet when all of the major airlines tried to copy the low-cost model, they all managed to get it. Didn't copy the whole thing. They copied enough. They thought they were copying enough, but just ended up with losing money.
Right. So in the chapter you're referring to, so the book in The Imagination Machine is actually about the entire cycle of imagination. In other words, not just having ideas, but implementing those ideas and eventually replacing those ideas. So it's sort of cradle to grave imagination. One of the things that you need to do to scale the products of your imagination, your idea or your prototype, is you need to codify it. Let's imagine the Four Seasons Hotel or something that's some sort of reproducing legendary customer service the other side of the world. Codification is far from straightforward, because would you slap people on the back and say, be customer oriented, go for it? Not quite precise enough. Would you give them a 2,000-page standard operating procedure? Nobody would read it. So it comes down to the essential details. So often when companies imitate each other, they haven't thought deeply and hard about what are the essential details for success. And then, of course, you need to be able to replicate that thing on the other side of the world with different customers in a different culture under different conditions. So you need evolvability. So the key idea in that chapter is something we didn't invent, but we came up with a word for, which is evolvable scripts. So the idea of a script is something that you follow to reach a certain result, these essential elements of success. And the idea of evolvable is there's enough flexibility so that things can change with circumstances or be customized to each customer. Now, if you ask the question, how many companies have something like what we're calling an evolvable script? Very few, actually. So we think it's a little blind spot that companies can perhaps pay more attention to.
I have a sense that maybe innovation, as businesses get maybe to 100 people, which is quite small in the scheme of things, but they start to go from, particularly if they're quite young companies and therefore their growth has been exponential, they start to go from innovative and agile to, we need more process. And then those processes start to bludgeon out the innovation, and management layers start to increase. I've just got 100 because of the size of businesses that I work with. But have you seen, what do businesses have to put in place to keep that innovation culture?
Well, let's maybe focus on the negative first of all, which is, in some ways, it's quite mysterious that this very basic human capability of imagination, which every 5-year-old has, turns out to be extraordinarily difficult for large organizations. Why is that? Well, it's because there are a number of reasons for imagination disappearing or being suppressed. One of them is simply the mental model that we have of companies. So we have a mental model that 20 years ago would not have been wrong. It would have been a good approximation, which is that the small companies that have only a small chance of success, the startups, do the imaginative stuff. They come up with the new business models. And then for the next 100 years, the big company scales and drives efficiency and improves that founder's concept. We know from this study we did of fade rates that even big companies now need to be entrepreneurial. They need to have the capability of reinventing themselves. And so the first thing is the mental model. The second thing is, I think, this going too far with this imperative of standardization. So, the quirky founder that shouts at everybody and is completely intransparent. You can't run a large company with whim and eccentricity. So to some extent, you need to industrialize. It's one of the standard crises of a family company. They need to turn something from a sort of a personality cult into a business. Now, if you go too far, what you end up with is something that maybe very good. It just isn't very flexible. You've created an incredible inflexibility in the business, and of course, circumstances change. Then, if I were to mention two more, one would be complacency. We often talk about the success trap. I mean, today is a lot of the CEOs I interviewed for the book said essentially they were in some ways terrified of success. They were terrified of complacency, that if their results were good enough, that somehow they'd stop being hungry and stop looking for the next thing. And it's very easy to test this actually. In the next time you visit a company, if you wander around a company and you just make a checklist on two sides of a piece of paper, stuff that is internal in nature, people talking about internal references, the stuff which is external in nature, competitors and customers, and you find that by default, a small company will be obsessed with talking about what's going on in the outside because they're trying to survive in a complex and hostile world. By default, a large company will often be 80% internal. And if you think about it, that's not surprising because a company is a bit like a sphere. The more you expand the radius of the sphere, the size of the company, the lower the ratio of its surface area to the volume. So the number of jobs that are entirely internally facing in a large company is enormous. So it requires a special effort to become externally oriented, to be open to surprise, to actually see the world as it is, as opposed to through the lens of the dominant mental model of the company. So I think it's immensely valuable. And the reason we wrote the book is that we have playbooks and theories and papers on how to run all sorts of aspects of a business, but this creative side of strategy seemed to be a little bit underplayed. We didn't seem to have a playbook for imagination. There was even a notion out there that you couldn't possibly have a playbook for imagination. But sure, it's an unpredictable, frisky aspect of human affairs, but we have playbooks for HR and how to motivate a team. So why not have a playbook for imagination? And I think hopefully we were vindicated in that view.
Well, I'm going to dive in and pull out some other things, but I just wanted to touch on that. So I'm just thinking, sitting with a client leadership team, I can just audit. I can probably just mark on a piece of paper, as you say, 2 columns, like, are we talking about internal or external things? And I was struck because I've spent some time with a couple of people from the NHS over the last week, and they have no competitors. So they never talk about anything about outside the NHS, which might be why innovation seems so difficult for them, because actually there is no external, there is just internal. They both felt incredibly stuck and unable to make any change.
Right. And you've mentioned another key word there, change. It's hard to change big, complicated things because a lot of people have to be on board. A lot of people have to have the same motivation, the same information. And that's a hard thing. Unfortunately, change is often treated like a problem in project management. In other words, the goals are known, and all you need to do is to manage with discipline the timeline and the action points. Whereas I think actually change is a strategic problem. You need to know what sort of change problem it is, what the forces of change are, what the forces of resistance are, and you need to work on both sides of the equation: the forces of resistance and the thing propelling the change forward. And in some cases, that may be project management. In others, it might be peer-to-peer influence. In others, it might be learning. But one of the things that neuroscience tells us about imagination is that it's triggered by surprise, that the human brain at an individual level is extremely good at detecting there's pictures that kids play with where there are 7 details that are different between 2 versions of the picture. And the trouble with organizations is they don't look because they have standard procedures. There are a lot of internally facing jobs. There's a lot of politics. There's a lot of sort of top-down control that's great for efficiency of the existing recipe, but it doesn't in total necessarily or often equal a collective view of the outside, which generates the surprises or the anomalies, which are the triggers for imagination. Things that don't fit stimulate us to think, am I thinking about this right? They trigger a potential change in our mental model, but you have to look. It's the primary requirement of imagination, which is to be observational and externally oriented.
As you were talking about, people think about it as a project management thing. It's like, it's then going to be done to you. And often I see clients running change In the working genius model we use from Patrick Lencioni, there's one of the geniuses is galvanize. You look at an executive team, and sometimes we have teams that show up and there's nobody with galvanize at all on the team. And they say things like, well, we sent an email to the, and I think about galvanize as putting energy into the system to unlock it. Somebody's got to tell a story. We've got to say why we're doing it, because otherwise the system will be impervious to change. And the teams that turn up without galvanize sort of say, well, we sent an email and people didn't change. And you're like, are you, you're surprised? And it's just people don't see it. How do we sell it? How do we get people to believe that it's in their best interest? Because it's more effort. So often I see, this new IT system comes along and their existing system might not be very efficient, but they know how to do it. And so then it's completely broken. And the amount of time and effort and trouble people will go to continue to use the same mental model or the same process, inventing spreadsheets and not using the systems. It's extraordinary.
I think you're putting a finger on a number of important things there. So we've already dealt with look out of the window, which is see the anomalies, the changes in the world that will trigger your mental model. I think, one thing you're touching on there is the legitimization of what some people call, counterfactual thinking about things that are not the case. And one thing I sort of observed in the research for the book was that people confuse mental models with facts. So, for example, they might say, we have a 2% share in the pharmaceutical industry, and that sounds like a fact. But actually, you could frame yourself as being in the health business, the cures business, the information business. 2% depends on where you put the boundaries of the thing. And by saying that we're a pharmaceutical company, you're sort of implying there's a right way of doing things. Well, actually, your existing mental model is the way that you see the world. And often the mental model is the obstacle. So multiple mental models, and also it being okay in meetings, for example, to say, I have an idea. I know of one company, I won't mention the name, where if you say I have an idea, I have a hypothesis, the engineers will immediately shoot you down as being not fact-based, not scientific. But indeed, this is why we called the book The Imagination Machine, because if you think about it, a company doesn't get a right to exist or succeed unless it brings something new to the world. So in a strange sort of way, a company is in the business of making fictions realities. Essentially, the idea that became the pervasive reality is the definition of success. So when somebody says, I know something which is not true that could be true, we should be listening very carefully, but we often don't.
Yes, it happens. People tell you that that's not true. I see that all the time. People say, well, the company I was last at looked at this slightly differently. Somebody goes, yeah, but that's not true here. It's the equivalent of that's not how we do it. Or people say, well, we tried that in 1983, didn't work. And it's just, and yet at the same time, they can tell you that things aren't right, things aren't good, that they need to change. And yet they're happy to put effort into shutting down a discussion rather than rolling with it and saying, well, yeah, okay, but what else could, it's just, people get really fixed on defending the status quo. When you were interviewing people, the CEOs you interviewed, did any of them have, how do they think about helping their teams, other than sort of the other things we've already thought about? Think about how do we ditch the status quo?
Yeah, lots of ways, actually. So I'll give you two quick examples, which don't duplicate what we've already said and are quite powerful, I think. So I went to visit the Recruit company in Japan. Recruit is a services conglomerate, a business-to-business services conglomerate. They have businesses like real estate agencies, IT platforms, so beauty salons, restaurants, ski resorts. So B2B services, basically. Their belief is that in large companies, ideas don't spread because the focus is on the power of managing existing large businesses. So every company has two jobs: to run the current business, but also to prepare for the next. And the current business dominates because those guys, the people running the existing businesses, will have more people, more power, and so on. So they have an HR system which is predicated on rebalancing that. And the way that they do that is they deliberately construct entrepreneurial heroes in the company, which is they give great a spotlight and they celebrate the achievements of the people that have made new things, in addition to the people that run big existing businesses. And they express that excitement in many ways. But one of them is through the use of innovation festivals. So they have something called the Ring event every year to communicate the idea that the coolest thing in the company is to become an entrepreneurial hero. It's everybody's obligation and it's everybody's possibility. So literally anyone can get up on stage and say, yeah, I have an idea for the future. And if they have one other person that joins their team, they have automatic first round funding. So the excitement around creating new things in this company is a different relationship to size compared to the average large companies. That's one thing that you can do. You can focus on the transmission, the viral transmission of ideas by creating excitement and prestige around the new. Another example, which I quite like, is of a different nature. It was concerning a very successful consumer goods company called Hindustan Lever, which is the Indian subsidiary of Unilever. Very respected, very successful company in India. But the CEO, Nitin Paranjpe, knew that the company was stagnating. It was going off the boil. So he did two things to break the existing pattern, this pattern of stagnation. One of them is he sent everybody in the company, literally everybody, out into the field to answer 5 questions. And perhaps not surprisingly, question 3 was, what did you see that surprised you? So he basically said, go get surprised to the entire company. And this company with no ideas, or was running out of ideas, came back with something like 2,000 ideas. And the second thing he did was he set a goal that was on the limits of possibility. So they had one of the highest distribution densities, or the highest distribution density of any consumer goods company in India. And he said, double it. And this was a rather strange goal because it was not at all clear that it was even possible. And some back of the envelope calculations suggested that even if it was possible, it probably wouldn't be economic because you'd be distributing such small quantities to such remote villages, it probably wouldn't pay for itself. He did this not because it would necessarily succeed, but because he wanted to break the pattern. Had he set a more modest goal, his fear was they would have achieved it with existing thinking. In fact, they came up with a revolution in the thinking, and they came up with the idea of co-distribution, which is distributing not only their own goods, but the goods of others and a bunch of other items. So they actually met the goal, and they did succeed in breaking the current thinking. So these are just a couple of examples of ways in which fairly simple initiatives, if oriented towards imagination, can really break the logjam, break the stasis of large companies.
As you were talking, I was thinking, of course, 3M have had it culturally embedded in their business forever. BASF in Germany as well. They say it's not a one and done. It's we're going to do this. We're going to do this forever. I know, back in my own modest way at Rackspace, the year we had won the Management Today Service Excellence Awards, we did 26 benchmarking visits to companies to go and find things that they were doing that we thought would be applicable to us. And I sent out teams of 3. And people just go and shoot some videos and talk to some people in some companies they visited and find something that they thought we could implement back at home. And it was fabulous. People got really, really excited about the whole project.
I think the trick is to make it real, because you sort of have to break the pattern to create fear, reflection, and excitement. So you can do these things. I think it's important to do things such as the initiative you just referred to, but anything can become formulaic in business. It can be a checkbox exercise that doesn't actually lead to change, or it becomes ritualized so that you're doing the right things, but you're doing them, without excitement, without imagination. So I often think that doing the right things but changing the pattern is very important. So often that can be even symbolic. So there's a story of Satya Nadella at Microsoft that obviously has turned around and been very successful in aggregate as the CEO of new CEO of Microsoft. One of the things he did was purely symbolic, which is people used to come to the top meetings in Microsoft extremely well prepared with a thick binder of the answers to all possible questions. And in some ways, it was a hallmark of excellence that a company could be that well prepared. So he scrapped the binders, which was quite shocking because it was a well-established ritual. And along with this, said, no, we're no longer going to be the know-it-all company. We don't know it all. We're going to be the learn-it-all company. So it wasn't a very precise intervention. I mean, you had precise strategic moves elsewhere, but tremendously symbolic in saying this company is now going to do things differently.
And what about one of the other things that I see it even in smaller businesses that I work with, where you said you've got the existing management team that are running the current company. And to, if you're going to build something or you're going to create some innovation, often it's different and it's to the side. What are your thoughts on the sort of org structure and capital allocation and how in fact that success or otherwise might be measured? When you were doing your research, what conclusions did you come to around that?
Well, I think people often bemoan hierarchy and bureaucracy in companies, and the irony is that it's tremendously long-lived. And I think hierarchy and or as Adam Smith called it, the division of work is a very important organizational construct, which is very important for efficiency, that the financiers focus on finance and the marketers focus on marketing. But really, there are these two faces of business, the two hands of business. So if you like, that's the right hand. The left hand is the preparation of new models for the business, which is not about efficiency. It's about the creative side of the business, finding new ways of creating value in the world. And subdivision and layers and protocols is sort of anathema to that. So you're left with this sort of paradox. I think one of the most important things in business is this thing the business strategist called ambidexterity, which is the ability to do both of those contradictory things at the same time. I mean, let me give you a sort of fictitious example. If I'm a CEO and I say to you, Dominic, here's your job. I want you to hit your targets or exceed your targets. I want you to stick to the plan. I want you to squeeze every last cent of value out of the current plan. But also, I want you to let your hair down, take risk, don't be afraid of failing, be creative. You would slap your head and say that's a contradiction. And a lot of the CEOs I interviewed said, indeed, that contradiction is the ultimate contradiction of business. And they respond in different ways to that. I like Indra Nooyi, the former CEO of Pepsi's answer to that question, where her technique for achieving squaring this paradox was to have two heads of every business, run the business head and destroy the business head. And she saw her job as keeping them fighting to preserve the tension between today's business and the future business. And she said it's actually quite hard to keep them fighting because the barons of the current business, for instance, the sales heads and so on, they become pretty good at faking stories of innovation theater and pilot experiments and creativity. They can talk the talk. And the mavericks, the ones that are saying, no, in the future we have to do it a different way, or we have to change the portfolio, they disappear in the middle of the night, right? They get assassinated. They're an inconvenience, and they disappear, or they just get tired and they feel unappreciated. So for a CEO to balance those two forces is no trivial thing, I think, and that's part of this, because I'm talking about one half of the equation, but it's paid for by the other half of the equation. So both parts of ambidexterity are incredibly important.
And Martin, The Imagination Machine, fantastic read. I really enjoyed reading it. And obviously I've read Your Strategy Needs a Strategy as well, which is on the shelf behind me. But what else should people pick up if they're interested in innovation, imagination, and strategy?
Well, there are so many good books to choose from. I run a new business book podcast myself, and I select the books I think are worth reading, and I think we're somewhere over 100 now, and I'm still going. So,
and maybe it doesn't have to be about any of those topics. It could just be, what have you covered on what's your podcast called?
It's called Thinkers and Ideas.
Fantastic. And so maybe just like, what are the top few books that come to mind that you've covered on the show?
Recent books, Ethan Mollick, the AI theorist from Wharton. He just produced a great book called Living with AI. And so there are all sorts of books saying, how does it work? Is it going to destroy us? What do we use it for? But he takes a different tack. He says basically, but it's here. It may play out to have more or less functionality, more or less quickly. But the thing is, how do we live with it? If you have a mixed cognition organization where the human brains are doing some part of the task and the AI brains are doing some part of the task, like how do we use it to good effect? And so that was a very interesting book. It's about the principles that humans should employ in living with AI in corporations. So that was a good one. I like the book Obliquity. Obliquity is about the idea that some goals are defeated if you adopt them as goals. You don't get a lot of friends by trying desperately to have a lot of friends. It's an indirect result of doing something else. And the author argues that business is full of oblique goals, and there are ways of managing oblique goals. And I like this because it was a refreshing alternative to the sort of project management school of business, whereby you have your goal, you have your sort of process, you break it down into steps, and you measure it with a Gantt chart. Whereas no, you don't start with the thing you want in some cases. So I thought that was a very interesting book. I think Gerd Gigerenzer from the Max Planck Institute, Gerd Gigerenzer, he's famous for heuristics. He's a psychologist, and fast, frugal heuristics. There's a long way of solving things, and then there's using simple rules. And he just read a book called Intuition. So he defines intuition as the unconscious part of intelligence. It's a form of intelligence. It's very different from rational intelligence, and we often use it without knowing we're using it. And so he talks about refining intuition, the danger that we neglect our intuition in the age of focus on data and algorithms and so on. And throughout philosophical history, it's been the poor cousin of clever rationality. And so he makes a defense, a very practical defense of the role of intuition in business. I thought that was a great book. So there are three for starters.
Fantastic. That's brilliant. What's your genius?
What is my genius? I'm not sure I have one, but relative to the many things I'm bad at, I think I'm reasonably good at finding out what the question is, framing the question. Because in my 30 years plus of consulting, I never saw a project where the question was the right question. You always have to struggle first with the question before you try to answer the question. So framing.
What unpopular opinion do you hold, and how has it impacted your success?
What unpopular opinion do I hold, and what consequences has it had? I believe that strategy is an act of the mind, and it's an act of collective behavior. And so therefore the quality of discussion is the ability to discuss anything precisely is a key sort of foundation of strategy. I believe that we need to depoliticize business, at least within businesses, in order to be able to have the really hard, precise conversations, in order to have good strategies and good collective welfare. And I think companies need to pay more attention to that, because by default, there are many sort of no-go zones nowadays, a lot of normative thinking, a lot of fuzzy thinking, a lot of fuzzy terminology. So I think depolarization, depoliticization, depth of debate, depth of conversation is really important.
What drives you every day?
Curiosity, absolutely. I mean, I've always found everything interesting. I love problem solving. I love ideas, and hearing about a curious problem or some phenomena we don't have a word for, my curiosity drives me to engage with that, and that I think is pretty compatible with what I do.
What's the most recent thing you've learned, or the most recent skill you've acquired?
Well, I think for my entire professional life, I've been working on listening. I like the phrase, what do you say when you're listening? And I'm not very good at saying it. So, but it's a work in progress. I'm getting there.
What's the worst business advice you've ever received?
When somebody says, oh, in order to do that thing, you can do this and this and this and this and this and this. When the strategy is a wish list of everything, or an exhaustive list of all the things you could do, it's not particularly useful. To me, finding the simplicity in the the complexity is much rarer. I actually heard Satya Nadella say something like this. He said, the whole point of management is to create complicated situations and make them simple and tractable. And more often than not, I see people running that machine in reverse.
What do you think is the biggest myth in business?
That it's mostly a financial equation. I think that's the sort of impersonal side of business, which is important. Finances and strategy tools and analytics. But the whole point of business is to serve human ends, and we use human means to serve those human ends. So really, you can't. We have to deal with the sort of the problematic term in the equation, which is the humans. It's all about the humans, and of course that's very messy. So the business as a financial equation, I think, is one of the least useful ways of looking at business.
Fantastic, that's brilliant, Martin. Thank you very much indeed for coming on the show today.
My pleasure. We scratched the surface of a lot of deep subjects. I hope it's somewhat intelligible to your listeners.
Excellent.